45 facts that turned out to be political propaganda. These weren't just harmless lies. They were weapons used to shape history, destroy lives, and erase entire cultures. What if everything you've been told about the past was nothing but a carefully crafted illusion? In the next few minutes, you'll uncover how these so-called truths were designed to manipulate and control. The real victims of these lies were hidden in plain sight, their stories buried beneath the weight of political agendas. Get ready to uncover the truth, one that will change how you see history forever. Chapter 1. The Myth of the Just. Cause for World War I. World War I was sold as a fight for freedom, justice, and peace, a noble crusade to end all wars. The propaganda machine painted a picture of heroic soldiers marching to save the world from evil. But the truth was far darker. The war wasn't about freedom, it was a power struggle between empires, with the lives of millions traded for political control. Soldiers were sent to the front lines believing they were defending honor, but in reality, they were pawns in a deadly game. For the victims, the nightmare didn't end with the war's conclusion. Families who lost their loved ones never knew the real reason behind their sacrifice. The political elites who started the war were never held accountable. The survivors returned home to a world that didn't want to acknowledge the true cost of the bloodshed. What no one realized at the time was that this war was only the beginning of an era of manipulation that would leave its mark on generations to come. Chapter 2. The Erasure of Holocaust. Survivors' Nazi propaganda painted Jews as subhuman, enemies of the state, a dangerous force that needed to be eradicated for the survival of the Aryan race. This lie justified the unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust, as millions were sent to concentration camps and extermination facilities. But the real victims weren't just the millions who died. They were the survivors, whose stories were often ignored, erased, or downplayed for decades. The world turned a blind eye, allowing the horrors to continue. And when the war ended, the survivors returned to a world that was reluctant to hear their pain. Political leaders minimized their suffering, and for many, justice was never served. The lies told by the Nazi regime didn't end with the camps. They continued to haunt the survivors, whose voices were silenced in favor of maintaining the narrative of a just war. But the darkest part of the Holocaust was not just the genocide. It was how history was manipulated to deny the true extent of the atrocity. Chapter 3. The Lies Behind the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was sold to the American public as a fight against the spread of communism, a battle for freedom and democracy. Politicians framed it as a righteous cause, a mission to protect the world from the Red Menace. But the truth was far more complicated and devastating. The real reason for the war wasn't about freedom at all. It was about maintaining power and influence in Southeast Asia, a political maneuver that cost millions of lives. For the Vietnamese, the war was a nightmare of destruction and displacement. Villages were bombed, families were torn apart, and entire communities were wiped out, all for a fabricated cause. Meanwhile, American soldiers were sent to die for a war they couldn't understand, convinced that they were defending democracy, unaware they were being manipulated. The lies didn't end when the war did. The true victims, the Vietnamese civilians, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, their pain overshadowed by the false narratives told by the powers that be. Chapter 4. The Atomic Narrative. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were justified by the U.S. government as necessary acts to end World War II and save countless lives. The narrative painted these horrific events as a calculated, though painful, means of forcing Japan's surrender. But the truth was far more sinister. The decision to drop the atomic bombs wasn't just about ending the war, it was about demonstrating power and sending a political message to the Soviet Union, igniting the Cold War. The real victims were not just the immediate thousands who died in the blasts. It was the survivors, known as hibakusha, who lived with the haunting effects of radiation sickness, their bodies forever marked by the bomb. Their suffering was largely ignored, and the political narrative surrounding the bombings glossed over the true cost of using such a devastating weapon. The U.S. justified the bombings to the world, but what was hidden was the unimaginable suffering of the survivors, victims of a political decision that changed the world forever. Chapter 5. Mao's Glorious Vision, The Great Leap Forward. Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward was presented as the bold solution to transform China into a modern, industrialized nation. The propaganda painted a picture of prosperity, promising a better life for all. But the reality was a devastating failure. The campaign, driven by political ambition, led to one of the deadliest famines in history. Millions of peasants were starved to death, their suffering hidden behind the lies of an optimistic government narrative. Mao's government claimed the famine was the result of natural disasters, but the true cause was policy failure and mismanagement. The victims weren't just the ones who died from hunger. There were the families torn apart by the regime's relentless push for industrialization at any cost. What the world didn't know was that the Great Leap Forward was a direct result of propaganda, an attempt to craft a utopia that, instead, led to unimaginable suffering. And the real cost would be felt for generations to come. Chapter 6. The Forgotten Genocide. The Armenian genocide was portrayed by the Ottoman Empire as a consequence of Kari, wartime chaos, an unavoidable byproduct of rebellion. Political propaganda twisted the truth, framing the Armenians as traitors who deserved their fate. The real victims, however, were the men, women, and children systematically murdered or forced into death marches across the desert. Their suffering was obscured by a veil of political lies that aimed to erase the atrocity. For generations, the survivors of the genocide were denied recognition. The Turkish government used propaganda to minimize the scale of the tragedy, labeling it as something less than a genocide. The true horror was not only in the massacre itself, but in the global indifference to the suffering of a forgotten people. The victims were not just erased from history, they were blamed for their own slaughter. This lie persists today, as the world continues to grapple with the legacy of a genocide that was covered up by political maneuvering. Chapter 7. The Civil Rights Struggle. During the Civil Rights Movement, Southern political leaders used propaganda to frame the fight for equality as a threat to American values, portraying peaceful protesters as violent extremists. The media, controlled by the powerful, painted these heroes as criminals, undermining the moral legitimacy of their cause. The real victims were the African Americans who courageously fought for their basic rights, their dignity trampled by lies that portrayed them as the enemy. These lies were more than just misleading, they were weapons used to keep the status quo intact. The true heroes of the movement were demonized, while the system of oppression continued unchecked. Their struggle for freedom was not just against physical violence, but against a society that refused to see them as human equals. Chapter 8. Soviet Lies. The Gulag System. Under Stalin's regime, Soviet propaganda presented the gulags as mere labor camps for criminals, but the truth was far darker. These camps were filled with political dissidents, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens who dared to challenge the state. The real victims were not just the prisoners who were tortured and executed, but their families who were left to suffer in silence, their loved ones erased from society without a trace. The lies surrounding the gulags were carefully crafted by the Soviet government to hide the scale of the atrocities. The victims were branded as criminals, their voices silenced by the system that controlled every narrative. The propaganda machine worked relentlessly, turning the truth into a weapon of mass deception. The gulags may have been closed long ago, but the scars remain. Chapter 9. The Assassination of Patrice Lumumba. Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected prime minister of the newly independent Congo, was framed by Western powers as a dangerous radical, a threat to global stability. Political propaganda painted him as a communist sympathizer, justifying his assassination as a necessary action to protect Western interests in Africa. But the real victims were the Congolese people, whose dreams of independence were crushed by foreign interference and manipulation. Lumumba's political vision was one of unity and independence for his people, but the Western narrative twisted his ideals, turning him into a villain. His assassination, backed by both the United States and Belgium, set the stage for decades of instability in Congo. The country's potential was stolen, its people left to suffer under a corrupt puppet government. The truth of Lumumba's murder was buried, his legacy erased. What no one realized was that the Congo's tragedy wasn't just about one man's death. It was the beginning of a larger, deeper exploitation of an entire nation. Chapter 10. The Famine That Never Happened. The Chinese government's narrative surrounding the Great Famine of the late 1952 downplayed its devastating effects, blaming the disaster on natural causes. Propaganda from Mao's regime painted a picture of agricultural progress, while millions of peasants starved to death in silence. The Great Leap Forward, which was supposed to be a symbol of China's strength, turned out to be a catastrophic failure that led to one of the worst famines in human history. The real victims were the people who suffered in the shadows, families torn apart by hunger, communities decimated by famine. They were labeled as mere statistics in a government report, their stories erased by the political machine that sought to protect its image at all costs. While the regime continued to project an image of success, the truth of what was happening on the ground was ignored, and millions paid the price. Chapter 11. Crusaders or Conquerors. The Crusades were framed by European powers as holy wars to reclaim Jerusalem from the infidels. Political propaganda glorified these wars, portraying the Crusaders as righteous knights fighting for God's will. But the reality was far more brutal. These holy wars were, in fact, brutal invasions, with the true victims being the Muslims, Jews, and even Christians who lived in the lands being conquered. The Crusaders, blinded by religious fervor and political ambition, slaughtered entire cities, leaving a trail of death and destruction. The truth of these wars, motivated by greed and power rather than religious righteousness, was buried under a mountain of propaganda that painted them as virtuous defenders of the faith. What no one realized at the time was that the Crusades were less about religion and more about political control, with the victims' suffering hidden beneath the weight of a narrative that justified conquest under the guise of divine intervention. Chapter 12. The Civilizing of Native Americans. Colonial powers justified their invasion of the Americas with the claim that they were civilizing the indigenous peoples, painting themselves as benevolent figures, bringing order to a chaotic world. But the truth was far from this narrative. The real victims were the Native Americans, whose cultures, traditions, and lives were systematically destroyed by European settlers. The propaganda depicted the indigenous populations as savages, and in doing so, it erased the rich histories of thriving civilizations that had existed for centuries. The settlers' violence and land theft were justified by these false narratives, and the lives of countless innocent people were lost in the name of progress. The horrors of colonization were buried under layers of lies, with the true cost hidden from history. The indigenous peoples were dispossessed of their land, their children stolen, and their very identity threatened by a narrative that portrayed their destruction as inevitable. No one realized was that the real savages were those who came to civilize them. Chapter 13. The Inquisition's Lies. The Spanish Inquisition was framed as a righteous campaign against heresy, a moral crusade to protect the faith. The propaganda portrayed it as a necessary action to purify the Christian world. But the reality was far more sinister. The Inquisition was a tool used by the Spanish monarchy to control and oppress its people, silencing anyone who dared to challenge its authority. The true victims were the Jews, Muslims, and suspected heretics who were tortured and executed under the guise of religious duty. The Inquisition wasn't just a religious institution, it was a political machine, erasing entire communities and their beliefs to consolidate power. The propaganda surrounding the Inquisition downplayed the brutality, presenting it as a just cause for the greater good. In truth, it was a series of horrific acts carried out in the name of power and control. The real cost wasn't just the lives lost, but the destruction of cultural diversity and freedom of thought. The world didn't know that the Inquisition was less about faith and more about maintaining power through fear. Chapter 14. Women, the invisible victims. Throughout history, political propaganda has systematically excluded women from narratives of power, progress, and achievement. From the rise of empires to the shaping of societies, women's contributions were ignored or downplayed, leaving them invisible in the story of humanity. Propaganda painted women as secondary, limiting their roles to the home while men were hailed as the driving force behind civilization's greatest accomplishments. The real victims were the countless women whose voices were silenced, their achievements erased, and their opportunities restricted. Their contributions to science, politics, and art were dismissed or stolen, and the narratives of history were rewritten to favor the male perspective. This deliberate erasure wasn't just a matter of neglect, it was a calculated effort to keep women powerless. Their potential was stifled by a system that used propaganda to convince society that they were incapable of greatness. The true cost of this propaganda was the loss of countless contributions that could have changed the course of history forever. Chapter 15. The Witch Hunt's False Narrative. The European witch hunts were fueled by propaganda that painted women, often the most vulnerable in society, as witches in league with the devil. Political and religious authorities spun a narrative of fear, claiming that these supposed witches were a threat to the entire community. But the truth was far more terrifying. The hunts weren't about eradicating evil, but about consolidating power and silencing dissent. The real victims were not only the women burned at the stake, but the entire society that allowed the lie to spread unchecked. They were scapegoats in a world where power structures used fear to maintain control. The propaganda machine justified the mass killings by distorting spiritual beliefs and exploiting people's fears of the unknown. The victims were portrayed as dangerous others, but in reality, they were merely ordinary women who were misunderstood or targeted for their independence. The witch hunts weren't just a campaign of religious fervor. They were a calculated attempt to eradicate any threat to the status quo. Chapter 16. The Colonial Mission. Colonial powers justified their domination of African territories with the narrative of a civilizing mission, portraying themselves as benevolent forces bringing order to uncivilized lands. Propaganda painted European rule as a noble cause, suggesting that the Africans were in desperate need of guidance. But the truth was far different. The real victims were the indigenous people, whose land, resources, and culture were violently stripped away in the name of progress. The so-called mission was nothing more than a cover for exploitation and theft. Entire civilizations were destroyed, their histories erased by the conquerors, who justified their actions with lies about superiority and civilization. The brutality of colonization was masked by a narrative of uplift, but the cost was the erasure of centuries-old cultures and the destruction of communities. And the lies that justify this devastation continue to influence our view of history today. Chapter 17. The Myth of Japanese-American Disloyalty during World War II, the U.S. government used propaganda to paint Japanese Americans as a national security threat, justifying the forced internment of over 100,000 innocent citizens. The government framed these individuals as enemies of the state, despite no evidence of disloyalty. The real victims were families torn apart and lives shattered by suspicion and fear. The narrative portrayed Japanese Americans as traitors, yet the reality was that they were simply the victims of racial prejudice, scapegoated for the actions of a few. Their civil rights were stripped, and their loyalty to America was never questioned until the propaganda machine turned them into an enemy within. The true cost was the lasting trauma and the years of injustice faced by those who were wrongfully imprisoned. Chapter 18. The Honorable Crusaders. The Crusades were sold to the masses as holy wars, a divine mission to reclaim Jerusalem from the Muslims. The propaganda painted the Crusaders as knights of righteousness, fighting in the name of God. But the truth was far more complex and brutal. These wars weren't about religion, they were about power, wealth, and territory. The real victims were the innocent civilians caught in the crossfire of a brutal conquest. The Crusaders, driven by greed and imperial ambitions, slaughtered entire populations, including Christians who lived in the Holy Land. The propaganda obscured the true motives behind the wars, which were rooted in political and economic control rather than religious devotion. The lies about the Crusades reshaped the history of the Middle East and Europe, creating a legacy of violence and mistrust. Chapter 19. Palestinian Displacement. The creation of Israel in 1948 was framed by political propaganda as the fulfillment of a biblical promise, a historic return to a land once lost. But the real victims were the Palestinians, who were displaced from their homes and forced into refugee camps. The propaganda justified the displacement as an inevitable consequence of history, but the truth was much darker. While the establishment of Israel was framed as a noble cause for the Jewish people, it came at the expense of the Palestinian population, whose lives were uprooted and erased from the narrative. The world's response was largely indifferent, and the victims of this political maneuver have suffered for decades. The lies surrounding the creation of Israel continue to influence the ongoing conflict in the region, with the Palestinian people still fighting for recognition and justice. Chapter 20. The Irish Famine's Blame. The Irish potato famine of the mid-1800s was framed by British authorities as a natural disaster, a tragic but inevitable event. Yet, the truth was far more sinister. The British government's response to the famine was slow and indifferent, exacerbating the devastation. Political propaganda shifted the blame to the Irish themselves, portraying them as incapable of managing their own affairs, rather than acknowledging the British government's failure to act. The real victims weren't just those who starved to death, but the generations of Irish families were denied aid while British policies prioritized exports over relief. The famine wasn't just an act of nature, it was a man-made disaster, hidden by lies and political manipulation. The Irish people were not just victims of hunger, but of a system that used propaganda to avoid responsibility and place blame elsewhere. But the manipulation of truth didn't stop with the famine. The next chapter reveals how apartheid was justified by even more dangerous lies. Chapter 21. The Lies of Apartheid. Apartheid in South Africa was justified through political propaganda that portrayed racial segregation as necessary for maintaining societal order. The system was sold as a way to preserve peace and stability in a nation divided by race, but the reality was a brutal system of institutionalized racism designed to control and oppress the black majority. The real victims were not just those who lived under the regime, but their descendants, who continued to feel the scars of a system that denied them basic rights. Propaganda painted black South Africans as inferior, and this lie became the foundation of laws that segregated schools, hospitals, and neighborhoods. The lies of apartheid justified violence, economic exploitation, and cultural erasure. For decades, the world turned a blind eye, and the victims' voices were drowned out by the false narrative of racial superiority. Chapter 22: Stalin's Purges. The Hidden Dead. Stalin's purges in the Soviet Union were portrayed as necessary for the survival of the state, a means to eliminate threats to national security. The political narrative justified mass arrests, torture, and executions, while the real victims, millions of innocent people, were blamed for imaginary crimes. The purges were framed as an effort to protect the revolution, but in truth, they were a way for Stalin to consolidate his power. Millions of political dissidents, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens were executed or sent to labor camps, their names erased from history. The propaganda machine turned them into enemies of the people, and their suffering was ignored or denied by the state. What Stalin didn't anticipate was the long-term damage done to Soviet society, where fear and distrust replaced solidarity, and the truth of his reign of terror remained hidden for decades. Chapter 23: The Assumed Superiority of European Civilization. European colonial powers justified their conquests by claiming they were bringing civilization to the savage lands they conquered. Propaganda painted these imperialists as noble heroes on a mission to uplift the uncivilized peoples of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. But in reality, colonialism was about exploitation, resource theft, and domination. The real victims were the indigenous populations, whose cultures were destroyed, their lands stolen, and their identities erased by the invaders. The so-called civilizing mission was a lie that masked the brutality of colonial rule. The political narrative made it seem as though the indigenous peoples were better off under colonial control, when, in fact, their lives were shattered. Colonial powers used these lies to justify centuries of violence, turning entire populations into subjects of empire. The victims were not only robbed of their land, but their voices were silenced by the lie of European superiority. Chapter 24: The Suppression of Irish Identity. During British rule, Irish culture, language, and identity were systematically suppressed. Political propaganda portrayed Irish traditions as inferior, and the British government's policies worked to erase the Irish people's unique cultural heritage. The real victims were the generations of Irish people whose language and customs were outlawed or ridiculed. Irish schools were forced to teach in English, and Irish Gaelic was stripped of its prestige. What's more, Irish national identity was deliberately destroyed by a propaganda machine that sought to integrate the Irish into a larger British Empire, painting their distinct culture as backward and primitive. What the British failed to realize was that these efforts to suppress Irish identity would only strengthen the Irish people's resistance, fostering a sense of unity that would later fuel the push for independence. However, the fight for cultural survival wasn't unique to Ireland. In the next chapter, we uncover how a country's very existence was erased by a wave of imperial deception. Chapter 25: The Victims of Political Revolutions. Revolutions often come with promises of freedom and equality, but history is littered with revolutions that only replaced one form of oppression with another. Political propaganda during these revolutions painted them as righteous struggles, but the true victims were the people caught in the crossfire, ordinary citizens who lost their lives, their rights, and their futures. The French and Russian revolutions, for example, promised liberation, yet they delivered terror. Leaders like Robespierre and Lenin used propaganda to justify mass executions and purges, painting their victims as enemies of the revolution. But the real cost was the loss of humanity in the name of political power. The revolutionary rhetoric justified violence and betrayal, leading to more suffering than those who fought for change could have ever anticipated. These revolutions, which were supposed to liberate, instead left their citizens to deal with the aftermath of lies and manipulation. What happened next would make these revolutions pale in comparison. The next chapter uncovers how a nation's culture was completely wiped out by a deceitful conqueror. Chapter 26. The Conquest of the Aztecs. Hernán Cortés and his forces justify the invasion of the Aztec Empire by framing it as a religious mission to spread Christianity. Propaganda portrayed the Aztecs as barbaric, with their human sacrifices painted as a reason for their conquest. But the truth was far darker. The real reason for the invasion was power, wealth, and control over the region's resources. The Aztecs, despite their complex society, were dehumanized by European conquerors who used lies to justify their violence. Entire cities were razed, and millions of indigenous people were slaughtered in the name of civilizing them. The conquest wasn't about religion, it was about conquering the Americas for European gain. The narrative constructed by the Spanish invaders erased the rich history of the Aztec people. What no one realized was that the brutality of this conquest would set the stage for centuries of colonial violence. The Aztec Empire wasn't the only civilization to be erased by colonial lies. Chapter 27. The Slave Trade's False Justifications. The transatlantic slave trade was justified by political propaganda that depicted enslaved Africans as subhuman and suited for servitude. Lies about the supposed inferiority of Africans were spread to legitimize the brutal system of slavery that spanned centuries. The real victims were the millions of men, women, and children who were forcibly taken from their homes, stripped of their identities, and sold as property. European colonial powers used propaganda to convince the public that enslaving Africans was a moral good, an economic necessity, and even a civilizing mission. In reality, it was an inhumane system of exploitation that destroyed entire cultures and generations. The consequences of this propaganda are still felt today, with the scars of racism and inequality continuing to impact society. What was hidden was the true cost of the lies, the stolen lives, the broken families, and the generations robbed of freedom and dignity. But the lies didn't end with slavery. Chapter 28. The Soviet Famine. In the 1930 seconds, Stalin's regime imposed policies that led to the Soviet famine, particularly in Ukraine. While the government spread propaganda claiming that the famine was the result of bad weather and crop failure, the real cause was a brutal man-made disaster caused by Stalin's collectivization policies. Millions of people starved, and the true extent of the suffering was concealed by lies. The victims were the peasants who had their grain seized by the state, leaving them with nothing to eat. Stalin's narrative justified the death of millions by framing them as enemies of the state. The propaganda shifted blame to the people themselves, painting them as traitors for not cooperating with the regime's policies. The famine was a direct result of political greed and control, not a natural disaster. Yet, the suffering was minimized by the Soviet regime's refusal to acknowledge the real cause. While Stalin's lies ravaged millions, other oppressive regimes were also hiding their darkest secrets. The next chapter exposes how one such regime manipulated an entire population through political propaganda. Chapter 29. Genghis Khan's Conquests. Genghis Khan's invasions of the Mongol Empire were portrayed by many as the actions of a heroic and visionary leader. But political propaganda hidden in the narrative painted him as a warrior of destiny, while the truth was that his campaigns were brutal conquests that left millions dead. His empire, built on war, was justified as a necessary force for expansion and unity. The real victims were the civilians caught in the Mongol invasions, their cities destroyed, and families wiped out. The propaganda that surrounded Genghis Khan's rise framed him as a unifier, ignoring the widespread devastation his conquests caused across Asia and Europe. The legacy of these brutal campaigns has often been romanticized, but the victims, people who simply lived in the way of his empire, are often forgotten. Their pain buried under a facade of historical glorification. But the story of conquest didn't end with Genghis Khan. The next chapter reveals how the myth of manifest destiny led to a new kind of colonization. Chapter 30. The Myth of Manifest Destiny. The United States used the idea of manifest destiny to justify the westward expansion across North America. Propaganda presented the concept as a divine right, claiming that it was America's fate to spread democracy and civilization from coast to coast. But the truth was far more destructive. The real victims were the Native American tribes who were forcibly displaced, their homes destroyed, and their cultures erased in the name of progress. The idea of manifest destiny dehumanized indigenous peoples, framing them as obstacles to America's natural expansion. The false narrative of manifest destiny ignored the violent consequences for the people who had lived on the land for centuries. This ideology laid the groundwork for the systematic removal and destruction of Native American communities, all justified by a politically convenient lie. The lies that justify the conquest of the American West had far-reaching consequences. In the next chapter, we'll uncover how another colonizing power manipulated the masses to fuel its own empire-building efforts. Chapter 31. The Exploitation of African Resources. Colonial powers justified their extraction of Africa's vast resources by claiming they were helping the continent develop. Propaganda painted colonization as a mutually beneficial arrangement, where Europeans brought prosperity and order to the dark lands of Africa. But in reality, it was a system designed to exploit the continent's wealth while leaving its people impoverished. The real victims were the African populations who had their lands stolen, their resources exploited, and their labor used for the benefit of foreign powers. The wealth generated from Africa's resources didn't go to the people, but to the colonizers who profited from minerals, oil, and agriculture. The narrative of a civilizing mission was a lie, a tool used to justify decades of economic exploitation. The people of Africa were forced to live under systems that stripped them of their rights and potential. Chapter 32. The Spanish Conquest of the Incas. The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire was framed as the discovery of a primitive people by the invaders, who justified their violence as a mission to bring Christianity and European civilization to the savages. Propaganda painted the Incas as uncivilized and in need of saving, but the truth was far darker. The real victims were the Incas themselves. Their empire was one of the most advanced civilizations of its time, rich in culture, art, and agriculture. Yet, the Spanish, driven by greed and a thirst for conquest, wiped out their society in pursuit of gold and land. The Inca people were portrayed as inferior, and their civilization was destroyed in the name of progress. The story of their downfall was written by their conquerors, who justified their brutal actions with lies of superiority and divine right. Yet the conquest of the Incas was not the only brutal invasion driven by political deceit. The next chapter reveals how the Huguenots were persecuted under a twisted narrative of loyalty. Chapter 33. The Huguenots' Persecution. In 16th century France, the Huguenots' Protestant reformers were vilified by Catholic political leaders. Propaganda portrayed them as a threat to the French state, branding them as enemies of the crown and the church. The truth was that they were simply seeking religious freedom, but the narrative surrounding them was twisted to justify their persecution. The real victims were the Huguenots, who were massacred during the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre and forced into exile. The propaganda machine demonized them as traitors, and this lie helped to justify the widespread violence they faced. What followed was a systematic effort to erase the Protestant presence in France, driven by political leaders who used lies to maintain control and power. The Huguenots were stripped of their rights, their culture, and their safety, all in the name of religious and political conformity. Chapter 34. The exclusion of women from history. Throughout history, political propaganda systematically excluded women from the pages of history, stripping them of recognition and agency. Propaganda painted women as caretakers, with their value confined to the domestic sphere, while men were portrayed as the true creators of civilization. The real victims were the countless women whose achievements were overlooked, their contributions minimized, and their voices silenced. The narrative of history was written to elevate male figures and exclude women from the great works of literature, science, and politics. The lies about gender roles shaped an entire societal structure, keeping women from education, leadership, and political power. Women who fought for their rights were branded as radicals, while their male counterparts were hailed as heroes. Yet, the systematic erasure of women's voices didn't stop in history. The next chapter unveils how the so-called noble past was nothing more than an excuse to silence the oppressed. Chapter 35. The erasure of African history. European colonizers rewrote African history to fit their narrative, portraying the continent as a land without civilization, culture, or history before European arrival. Propaganda portrayed Africa as a place in need of civilizing, using lies to justify centuries of exploitation, land theft, and cultural erasure. The real victims were the African people, whose rich histories, languages, and cultures were erased by colonial powers in favor of their own self-interest. Ancient kingdoms, sophisticated trade networks, and vibrant traditions were dismissed as primitive or barbaric. Colonial powers silenced the African voices that could have told their story, replacing them with a distorted narrative of inferiority. The propaganda machine created a false image of Africa that justified violence and control. The impact of colonial erasure still reverberates today. Chapter 36. The persecution of the Roma people. For centuries, European political propaganda painted the Roma as criminals and outsiders, spreading fear and distrust. Lies about their dangerous nature justified widespread persecution, forced migration, and exclusion from society. The real victims were the Roma, whose cultures were erased by the very societies that feared and demonized them. Accused of witchcraft, thievery, and other crimes, they were segregated, enslaved, and massacred under the guise of protecting societal order. The propaganda turned them into a scapegoat, blaming them for social issues that had nothing to do with their presence. The lies about the Roma perpetuated stereotypes that still haunt them today, making their struggle for equality and acceptance an ongoing fight. Chapter 37. The propaganda behind the partition of India. The partition of India was framed as a necessary action to separate two conflicting religious groups. Propaganda from both British and Indian leaders turned a complex issue into a simple narrative, where division was painted as inevitable. The real victims were the millions of people displaced by the division. Families were torn apart, communities broken, and entire regions marked by violence. The political justification for partition ignored the human cost, and the consequences were felt for generations. The victims' voices were drowned out by the political elites who sought to justify their decisions. The lie of a peaceful partition masked the brutal reality of mass migration, violence, and loss. What was seen as a solution was, in fact, the beginning of an ongoing tragedy. Chapter 38. The control of the media during wartime. During times of war, governments control the narrative, shaping public opinion through media manipulation. Propaganda during World War II, for example, turned entire populations into soldiers of ideological warfare, with media used to dehumanize the enemy. The real victims were the civilians, both in enemy countries and in the home front, whose lives were altered or destroyed by manipulated information. Political leaders twisted the truth, using media as a weapon to rally support for devastating wars, while glossing over the real human cost. The lies didn't just affect soldiers on the battlefield. They poisoned public perception and perpetuated fear, making victims out of innocent people who were seen as enemies. Chapter 39. The Persecution of the Jews during the Middle Ages. In medieval Europe, Jews were scapegoated through propaganda that portrayed them as villains, plotting against Christians and society. The real victims were the Jewish communities, who were expelled, tortured, and murdered under the false claim of a religious conspiracy. This narrative spread across Europe, with political leaders using it to unite the masses under a banner of fear. The truth was that the Jews were victims of xenophobia, used as a distraction from real political and social issues. They were ostracized, blamed for plagues, and persecuted during the Crusades. What was hidden by propaganda was the centuries-long oppression of a people who were scapegoated and demonized by false narratives, ultimately leading to violent massacres and forced conversions. But this wasn't the only religious persecution justified by lies. In the next chapter, we uncover how political leaders distorted the history of the Wild West. Chapter 40. The Myth of the Wild West. The American frontier was romanticized by political propaganda as a land of freedom and opportunity for all. This myth, however, ignored the brutal reality that the land was violently taken from Native Americans, and the heroes of the Wild West were often the perpetrators of genocide and land theft. The real victims were the Native American tribes who were massacred, displaced, and erased from the narrative. The myth of the Wild West glorified settlers as pioneers, painting them as freedom fighters, while glossing over the brutal violence they inflicted on indigenous populations. The false narrative of the Wild West has shaped American history, yet it concealed the systemic destruction of entire cultures. Chapter 41. The Lies Behind the Partition of Palestine. The creation of Israel was framed as the return of a persecuted people to their promised land, a noble cause for the Jewish people. However, the political propaganda obscured the devastating consequences for the Palestinian Arabs who were displaced, their homes stolen, and their communities uprooted. The real victims were the Palestinians, whose lives were torn apart by the creation of a new state. The false narrative portrayed them as obstacles to peace, ignoring their centuries-old presence in the region. Entire families were left without a home, and their voices were silenced by a global narrative that justified their suffering. The world was manipulated into accepting the partition as a justified act, while the Palestinian people were forced into exile and forced to live in refugee camps. Chapter 42. The Downplay of Colonial Atrocities. Colonial powers justified their exploitation of native populations by presenting themselves as benevolent rulers, bringing civilization to the world's savage lands. The political narrative of a civilizing mission masked the brutal reality of land theft, forced labor, and systemic violence. The real victims were the indigenous populations, whose cultures and lands were ravaged under the guise of progress. Colonizers used propaganda to erase the atrocities committed in their name, while presenting themselves as heroes of modernization. Entire civilizations were destroyed, their people left impoverished and marginalized. What was hidden was the true cost of colonialism, the destruction of rich histories and vibrant cultures, replaced by an oppressive system designed to benefit the few. But colonial lies didn't end with the exploitation of native peoples. The next chapter reveals the fabricated truth behind the suppression of Irish identity. Chapter 43. The Suppression of Irish Identity. Under British rule, the Irish language and culture were systematically suppressed, with propaganda portraying Irish customs as backward and primitive. The British government forced the Irish to abandon their traditions, erasing centuries of heritage in an attempt to integrate them into the empire. The real victims were the generations of Irish people who were denied their language, forced to assimilate, and stripped of their cultural identity. The narrative of Irish inferiority was perpetuated to justify this cultural genocide. What was hidden by political leaders was the profound loss of a rich, thriving culture. The consequences of this oppression are still felt today, as Irish people continue to reclaim their cultural heritage, fighting against the historical erasure imposed by colonial powers. This fight for cultural survival wasn't unique to Ireland. In the next chapter, we uncover how an entire population's identity was manipulated by a political system built on lies. Chapter 44. The downplay of colonial atrocities in Africa. European colonial powers used political propaganda to minimize the brutality of their conquests in Africa, framing their actions as a civilizing mission. The reality was that millions of Africans were enslaved, killed, or displaced, their land stolen, and their cultures decimated. The real victims were the African people, whose contributions to the world were erased in favor of a narrative that justified European control. The propaganda machine worked tirelessly to paint colonization as beneficial, hiding the truth about the violence, disease, and famine that followed in its wake. The lies that surrounded Africa's colonization still shape the world's perception of the continent today, ignoring the lasting scars of exploitation and control. But the propaganda surrounding Africa wasn't isolated. Chapter 45. The ongoing legacy of political propaganda. Political propaganda doesn't just distort history. It continues to shape the present and future. The lies told to justify wars, colonization, and oppression have left a legacy that still affects the way people view history, identity, and justice. The real victims of these lies are those whose voices were silenced, whose suffering was erased, and whose histories were rewritten to benefit the powerful. These lies continue to fuel division, perpetuate inequality, and distort the truth. But as the truth begins to emerge, the victims of history's propaganda are being heard. Their stories no longer hidden under layers of deception. The lies may have shaped the past, but the truth will shape the future. The battle for truth has only just begun, and in the next chapter, we'll witness how the hidden victims of history rise up to reclaim their stories. Final payoff. The victims of political propaganda were not just forgotten, they were silenced, erased, and left to carry the weight of history's lies. For centuries, these false narratives shaped the world, distorting the truth and hiding the real cost of power, control, and exploitation. But as the layers of deception are peeled back, the truth begins to surface. The stories of those who suffered under the weight of propaganda are finally being heard. The truth doesn't just reveal the victims, it uncovers the systems that used lies to maintain their grip on power. It's a reminder that the consequences of propaganda don't end with the lies themselves. They echo through generations, shaping societies and perpetuating injustice. But now, as these truths come to light, we can no longer ignore the impact of these lies. The real history, the one hidden for so long, will no longer be buried.